Welcome to Vellum Disintegration. Here I am inside of Houdini, and this will be the completed project file. And let's do a quick overview on everything that we are going to be creating. So you'll also be able to download this project file and inspect everything yourself. But let's start with the FX setup container here. So here is where we are going to create all of the geometry that we will need to drive our simulations in this FX setup container. And then FX Sims container will be where we actually set up all of the simulations. So let's step inside the FX setup and let's start from the start over here with our geo setup. We freeze the geometry and all of our geometry like the curves and everything else will be created on a static version. And then when we do our simulations, we are essentially going to map this geometry that we create back to our animated version. So we'll see how this works, but from our static geometry, we can generate the main curves. So this is really where our growth effects start on these main curves. So from these main curves, we spread out the growth effect to our fracture curves, which looks something like this. So this geometry is created based on our fracture geometry, and we'll see how this works as well. But from here, essentially, we can create, first of all, we can see we create the growing simulation only on our curves, which looks something like this. We also assign an age attribute here. And then from here, we can use this growth simulation on the curves and transfer it to scattered points, as we see over here, which allows us essentially to fill the entire hand geometry and then use these attributes in our simulations. So after we have all of our effects set up here, we can go up and we can go inside our FX Sims container. So here we can start with our Vellum simulation. And after we add our collisions, we set up the constraints and the solver. And like I mentioned, we can transfer the growth attributes from our points to our Vellum simulation. We are going to end up with something like this. So if I scroll my timeline a bit, this is what our skin disintegration layer will look like. We'll also add some post-processing effects like adding thickness to our pieces and scaling them over time so they disappear, and a bunch of other stuff, so we'll see this in the Vellum lesson. Then we can use the scattered points growth simulation to generate a smoke simulation, which looks something like this. And then using this pyro simulation, we can advect our particles, so our main particle layer, we should end up with this type of effect as we see over here. And then using the same pyro simulation, we are going to create a separate pop simulation, which we will use to scatter additional fractured pieces onto these points to add more detail to the overall simulation. So this will be our SOP setup. So from here, I will hold down N and go over to LOPS to go inside Solaris. And here we can start from the top. We are going to bring in our camera with a scene import. Then we'll bring in our skin geometry and we'll assign a material for this. We are also going to create a transition between our regular skin material and a custom rocky material that we are going to create. We'll use that same custom material to assign it to our rocky hand geometry, which is essentially just our hand geometry, just with a different material. And then using a component builder, we are going to create a geometry with different variations that we can scatter onto our debris points, which will look something like this. And we're also going to set up some attributes here for the p-scale and orientation to help our particles scale up and down and also spin over time based on their age. And finally, we'll bring in our particle layer as well. So this will be pretty straightforward. And then we'll have all of the elements that we need from the SOP context. So we'll create a very simple light setup. And here for one of our lights, which will generate the volumetric God rays, we are going to assign a light filter library in which we are going to create a custom texture for our lights, so we have more interesting God rays. And then we are going to split up essentially the render into the main render, and with a little bit of extra adjustments here, we are going to be able to create a separate renders specifically for the volumetric God rays. So this will be the Houdini part, and then we can jump over into Nuke as well. This will be a very simple composition. If we look at this, we can see that it's really not such a huge script, and essentially here in this part is where we split up all of the AOVs. So if we look at either of these shuffle nodes, we can see that we bring in all of the different contributions per individual light, so we can grade them individually, and when we put them all together, we are going to end up with our main beauty. And on top of this, over here I have separated the contributions from the emission, so we have a little bit more control over this. But if we look at all of our merged shuffles, we are going to end up with something like this. And then on top of this, we can bring in our God rays, so this will be our volumetric setup, and this is how the result will look like. And finally, to the left over here, we also have the setup for our direct emission, which will be our particles. So here we are going to grade this, add some flare effects and glows, and then we can just plus this on top of what we have. And finally, we have just a few post-processing effects. We have a couple of gray nodes to help add a little bit more contrast, some camera diffusion, and just a few more post-processing effects, which I usually like to add in most of my comps. And then we can complete this entire comp and finish the project. So with the next lesson, we'll start in Houdini and recreate everything from scratch. So I will see you there.